Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the afternoon session of the 2022 Justice Center Summit. Without any further ado, I will turn it over to Dee Levy.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Dee Levy, and I'm the director of the Individual and Family Support Unit here at the Justice Center. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, but first I'm going to turn it over to Crystal Collins so she can introduce herself, and she's my fellow presenter today.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. As Dee said, my name is Crystal Collins, and by way of some background, I do have an elementary teaching degree. I've worked for and on behalf of individuals with disabilities for a little over 30 years. A lot of that time was in direct service, but also managing programs. And I've been with the New York State Justice Center for just shy of 7 years.
Thank you, Crystal. So my name again is Dee Levy, and I've been with the Justice Center since October of 2013, so not quite when we first opened, but pretty early on. My background is in social work. I have my MSW, and I also completed my Master's in Public Administration. My background is kind of a mix. I have both a clinical background working with domestic violence victims and victims of sexual abuse. And then I also have a background in policy and legislation from a number of years where I worked for the New York State Assembly on criminal justice policy and legislation. So kind of just some of the background. So I think with that, we're going to get started. And I believe the PowerPoint should be getting shared. Perfect. So today we'll be providing an overview of the Individual and Family Support Unit, and we'll go through our agenda in just a moment on the next slide. And in terms of what we'll be covering today, so we can move on to the next slide, we'll be covering and providing an overview of the Justice Center. We'll be providing an overview of the Individual and Family Support Unit. We'll also be going through a number of resources that are available. These are available both in print and on our website. And we'll highlight for you a few of the resources that are really most helpful and that we have found most beneficial. And then we will wrap up just briefly with a portion about self-care, which is especially important given everything that everyone has been going through over the last 2 years in particular. So with that, we will move on to the next slide. And so some of you may have participated in the Justice Center processes session, which took place earlier today, or in one of our other sessions from yesterday. If so, some of this may be a little bit repetitive. I like to think that hearing something a few times is helpful because it can help clarify, and also maybe it's just a good reminder. So bear with us. We'll get through just the overview of the Justice Center. The way that we're going to break this down is that we will then have an opportunity for questions. We'll have another session, another opportunity for questions. So there'll be opportunities to ask questions throughout our session today. And again, as Davin mentioned before, please use the chat box, and we are happy to answer as many questions as we can. So in terms of the Justice Center itself, we were created in 2013 through the Protection of People with Special Needs Act. Our doors opened on June 30th of 2013 at midnight. We started getting calls, I believe, at 2 a.m. So since then, we've been very busy. And our agency was essentially created because prior to the Justice Center's existence, there wasn't a consistent way of really carrying out oversight of abuse and neglect. And so our agency is really focused on restoring public trust in both the individuals that work in the systems and the systems themselves that work with vulnerable populations. Another sort of aspect of why it was so important for us to be created is because we didn't have, there were inconsistent laws and regulations prior to our existence. So the example that I often give is that you could have had a staff person who worked in one group home, maybe committed some sort of abuse or neglect, and then moved on to another group home, or bounced around from program to program. And so really with our creation, we were able to not only ensure consistency across the 6 state agencies that fall under our jurisdiction, consistency when it comes to reporting of abuse and neglect, but also it allowed us to identify trends, identify areas of concern or areas that we might want to provide more resources on. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well when it comes to some of the abuse prevention resources that we have and some of the functions within our agency. And so moving on, we're just going to go over the vision of the agency. We have both our vision and mission. I like to just take a moment to read the vision itself. I think it's important to really understand what we're here and what our focus is. And so the vision for the Justice Center is that people with special needs shall be protected from abuse, neglect, and mistreatment. This will be accomplished by assuring that the state maintains the nation's highest standards of health, safety, and dignity, and by supporting the dedicated people who provide services. And I think this is really important because it not only emphasizes the importance of protecting vulnerable individuals from abuse, neglect, and mistreatment, but it really emphasizes the importance of supporting the dedicated people who provide services. I think that oftentimes when folks think of the Justice Center, there's kind of this immediate thought around the abuse and neglect aspect of what we do, the investigations. But I think that it's also important for us to recognize that the vast majority of the folks that are doing the work out there that are providing direct services are dedicated, compassionate, caring professionals that are doing the work because they truly care about the populations they serve. And our focus is really on a smaller number of people that are bad actors that shouldn't be working within the system. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we move forward. So in our next slide, we're going to talk about our 6 state agencies, and these are the agencies that fall under our jurisdiction. I think the main thing to remember is that our oversight and our jurisdiction focuses on programs that are operated, licensed, and certified by these 6 state agencies. Many of you are probably very familiar with 1 or 2 of these agencies, and you may have had a lot of contact with them. You may be working through them. You may have a loved one that is receiving services from one of these programs. So again, I think some of these may resonate more for you than others, and I'll go through and kind of give some examples of each one. So in terms of our jurisdiction, we have oversight of around 1 million people in the state of New York, who again are receiving services through these state agencies and their programs. Through the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities, also known as OPWDD, that's where you will find intermediate care facilities, so our ICFs, our group homes, our day habs, our residential types of programs. For the Office of Mental Health, this is where we're focused more on inpatient psychiatric units, on community residences and treatment programs. For the Office of Addiction Services and Supports, also known as the WASAS, this is where we're going to see our addiction treatment centers, our, again, residential rehab programs, our community residential services, methadone clinics, things of that nature. The Office of Children and Family Services, also known as OCFS. This is where we'll see, again, our state-operated juvenile detention centers, residential and youth programs, treatment programs, runaway and homeless youth programs, and our family-type homes for adults. Then the next 2 are kind of smaller in terms of our jurisdiction. So the Department of Health is where we will have our summer camps and traveling day camps for children with developmental disabilities, and then a small percentage or small number of licensed adult homes that are serving individuals with severe mental illness diagnoses. And then our state education department, this is where we have our approved private residential programs, our state operated and state supported schools, out of state schools that are residential, and then our schools for the deaf and blind. And I think what's important when we talk about our jurisdiction is to also acknowledge that there are programs that don't fall under our jurisdiction. So one that we often get questions about involves nursing homes. Nursing homes don't fall under our jurisdiction. So again, we would, if somebody called our hotline, we would refer them to the nursing home abuse hotline. Another one that we get a lot of questions around involves public schools. So public schools don't fall under our jurisdiction. So I think when we think about some of those, or general hospitals, people will often reach out and say, you know, something occurred in a hospital. If it occurred within a psychiatric unit of a hospital, that would fall under our jurisdiction. Generally speaking, when jurisdiction questions come up, and we've had this come up where a member of the public may ask a question at a presentation. We may have a question where someone will say, well, I observed something happen, or I think about, I heard about something happening. We encourage folks to call the hotline, even if it's outside of our jurisdiction, although we may not be the ones who will be able to review it or investigate it. those referrals are still sent over to the appropriate state agency, so potentially one of the 6 listed here, and we are making them aware so that they have knowledge then of whatever occurred. And we'll talk about this a little bit more when we move on to the next slide, when we start talking about our call center and our hotline. So when we talk about the hotline, again, many of you may be familiar with our hotline. If you are not familiar with it, I'll tell you a little bit about it. We do have our number here, and it is also included in the chat box. And our hotline operates 24/7. We accept reports of abuse and neglect. I'll talk to you in just a moment about the different types of reportable incidents that we do accept. Again, we often get calls that fall outside of our jurisdiction, but what's important for us is that we're then referring them appropriately. One question we sometimes get is, what happens if somebody calls in familial abuse, for example? That's something that really should be reported to the statewide central register. So calls, for example, that would go to Child Protective Services or Adult Protective Services, when those come in, we make sure to refer them appropriately. In certain cases, we might do a warm transfer where the caller and the agent will stay on while they make the transfer to the appropriate hotline. We provide a lot of resources in our call center as well. So if somebody is calling in about nursing home abuse, for example, they will provide them with the correct number. And our call center agents are highly, highly trained. They mostly come from the provider world themselves. So they have a lot of knowledge about how things work within our systems, and really just a fantastic group of people to work with. So if you are interested in what the process involves when you make a report, we do have a sample recording on our website, so you can definitely check that out as well. And so again, one part of the call center, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is our information line. And the information line is really focused on providing resources, connecting people to disability-related resources. The information line, which we'll again cover in a little bit, is also where you can contact the individual and family support unit. So when you're trying to contact us, if you have one of our resources, there's a number on there, the 1-800-624-4143. You don't have to write it down. We'll be providing that later as well. That is the number that you can contact to connect with the information line and get to us. The other point that I just want to make about the hotline is that we receive around 10,000 reports of abuse and neglect a year. That certainly is a large number when we think about the total number of reports, but as you'll see, we'll break it down further in terms of how many of those reports are unsubstantiated and how many are substantiated. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. The other thing that I think is just important to recognize is that, again, we encourage folks to call our hotline while we have mandated reporters within our programs that are required to call in any sort of abuse or neglect, or if they're witness to or made aware of abuse and neglect. We also encourage family members, members of the public, individuals themselves, anyone that has a cause or concern about something that maybe has occurred or is made aware of something that may have occurred. The one just reminder that I'd like to put out there, and I always take the opportunity when I speak to folks in the public to really highlight this, at the end of the report, you receive a confirmation number. It's usually a 101 number. So just making sure that you take that down. It's helpful for us when we're providing status updates. It's also helpful in particular for family members. If later on you realize that you have more information, then you can call back and add more information. Ideally, when you're making a report, the more details you have, the more information that you have, the easier it'll be for us to classify it appropriately. So I really encourage folks to have as much information, dates, details, anything that you can provide, supervision levels, things like that are always helpful when you're calling in a report. So we're going to move on to the next slide. And we're going to talk about the different types of incidents that can be reported. So I mentioned that we get about 10,000 abuse and neglect reports. We also receive reports on significant incidents. And so these are specifically incidents that may result in harm to the health, safety, or welfare of a person receiving services, but don't quite rise to that level of abuse and neglect. And so typically what would happen with a significant incident is that we would take the report, we would again enter it into our database, and then it would be sent over to the provider, or rather to the state oversight agency, or the state agency. In this case, let's say the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities or the Office of Mental Health, whichever appropriate state agency it is. The referral will be made to them, and they will be made aware of the significant incident so that they can review it. We'll move on now to the next slide, where we'll talk about abuse. And so abuse is any sort of improper action that results in or is likely to result in physical, mental, or psychological harm. Oftentimes, we'll see cases of abuse that may involve some sort of physical abuse or, potentially an injury that someone may have suffered as a result of some sort of abusive act. So again, I would say that we receive, like we discussed before, around 10,000 reports of abuse and neglect. The vast majority of those are neglect, which is on our next slide. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. And so neglect is really action, inaction. We can move on to the next slide. Thank you. So neglect is action, inaction, or lack of attention on the part of the custodian that results in or is likely to result in physical injury or serious impairment. So when we think of neglect, I think one example that is helpful is thinking of supervision. So if someone is supposed to be on one-to-one supervision and the staff person has left the house, or the staff person maybe is sleeping, and because of that there's some sort of neglect, there's potential lapse in supervision, that's something that we tend to see as well. I think the other important thing to think about is that, and this is something that comes up a fair amount of the time when we speak with families, is that many of us, I think, may have a definition in our minds of what abuse or neglect may be, but I think it's important to also recognize that we have our statutory language, or the law, and the law really guides and governs what is defined in what way. And so sometimes we may have a case where someone will say, well, this seems like abuse to me, but we have to operate within the constraints or within the limits of the law, and that is something that also comes up in some of our cases. So we'll move on now to the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit about what happens with our investigations. So the Justice Center, and we have a wonderful team of investigators. They are, for anyone who had the opportunity to watch the processes overview today, you had an opportunity to hear a bit about our investigations processes. Our investigators are fantastic, are very well trained. Many of them come from the provider world themselves. They go through extensive training, in particular when it comes to working with vulnerable populations. We'll talk later about some of the various multidisciplinary approaches that we have. Multidisciplinary approaches, just general reminder, is when we have multiple specialties or expertise that are all together at one table working together. So our multidisciplinary approaches often involve our investigators, our advocates, our prosecutors, our attorneys, and other members of the team working together. And so our investigators have a lot of experience and a lot of training when it comes to handling sexual abuse cases, when it comes to handling death cases, when it comes to handling cases that really need to be sort of handled at kind of that higher level. So when we talk about our investigators and which cases we investigate, I think it's important for us to emphasize that we are not able to investigate every single case of abuse and neglect, right? We really don't have the resources to do that. So we primarily, the Justice Center, investigate the most egregious cases of abuse and neglect, criminal cases, those that might be prosecuted, for example, and those that occur in state-operated settings. What that means is that there are some cases that have to be assigned to the state agency. So I mentioned some examples before. So we may need to assign a case to the Office of Children and Family Services or to the Office of Mental Health, for example. At that point, the agency is going to make the decision about whether or not their investigators will investigate or if the provider will investigate. Generally speaking, and again, it depends on the provider, some providers have QA or quality assurance staff that are involved in the investigations. Some providers contract with outside investigations. So the investigation will be conducted by the provider or by the state agency. But what's really important is to remember is that all investigations come back to the Justice Center. We make the final determination when it comes to all of those investigations, regardless of who carries them out. And so this is where we make the final decision, and we'll talk about substantiated and unsubstantiated and how we make those decisions. But once that final determination is made, all of the parties are notified. So that includes our family members or the individual themselves, if they're a self-advocate, the subject or subjects, so the custodian or staff that was involved, and the provider. So the program itself is notified, and then the state agency is also notified as part of that letter. And so some of you may have received letters in the past. If you have as a family member or as an individual, then on the bottom of those letters, it often says, if you have any questions, please contact our individual and family support unit. So again, we certainly welcome you and encourage you to do that if you receive one of those letters, because again, we'll be able to kind of guide you through the process. The other thing that's important for us to just highlight is that the Justice Center and our Prevention and Quality Improvement Unit in particular also oversee corrective action plans as appropriate. So when a program maybe has some sort of policy that needs to be updated or there's training that needs to be implemented, those are some of the corrective actions that we will be able to review, to audit, and to follow up on, again, as appropriate. So we're going to move on to the next slide. And this is really where we're going to kind of talk a little bit about unsubstantiated or substantiated. And so what that really means is we have a threshold. So our threshold for how we make a decision about substantiating or unsubstantiating is related to a preponderance of the evidence. And what that means, and sort of kind of simplifying it, what it means is something more likely than not to have occurred. So the way I like to kind of explain it to folks is that if we think about the criminal system beyond a reasonable doubt, that's where we're looking at really beyond a reasonable doubt, as certain as we can be, right? So it's a pretty high threshold. When it comes to preponderance of the evidence, we're talking about, is this more likely than not to have occurred? I know some of the attorneys don't like when we use percentages, but in my mind, essentially, it's 51% versus 49%. So is it more likely, 51%, to have occurred? And the way we make that decision is based on the evidence. So one of the questions we sometimes get is, why do some cases take longer than others? And part of that is because we want to make sure that we have all of the evidence that we need to make a decision, to make that determination. And that can include the medical paperwork, that includes interviews, that includes service plans, that includes staffing plans. It includes a lot of information related to that particular incident. Another thing that I think is important to just clarify is that just because a finding is unsubstantiated, which means we don't have the evidence, doesn't mean that something didn't occur. What it means is that we don't have the evidence to show that it was more likely than not to have occurred. And I think that's a really important distinction that we like to make, especially when working with families, because I think it can be frustrating or upsetting to receive an unsubstantiated finding. The other piece of all of this, which we'll talk about later, and Crystal will cover this, is that we also can guide families through obtaining records. So if I'm a family member and a personal representative, and I want to know what may have occurred with a particular case, I can request information through records access. So we're going to move on to the next slide. And at this point, this is kind of a breakdown. So this is reflective of our numbers from 2021. And this gives you kind of a sense of our abuse and neglect case categories. As you can see here, about a third of our cases are substantiated. So again, about a third of our overall cases are substantiated. And then they're broken down into 4 categories. So I'm going to start with category 3 because I like to sort of emphasize categories that are related to a particular subject or a staff person versus category 4, which we'll talk about at the end, which is more specific to the providers themselves. So category 3 findings, we do make these for abuse and neglect cases. This is the sort of the lowest of our 3 findings that can be made against a particular subject. It's hard because one of the questions I often get is, someone will describe a particular circumstance and they'll say, okay, so would that be substantiated? What category would it be? And that's really not something that we can speak to without seeing the facts of the case. So for category 3, for example, a general example would be something like maybe a supervision issue, a neglect where there was a lapse in supervision, but the person was okay ultimately. Category 2 is the next highest level, and this is where we kind of start to see more egregious conduct when it comes to abuse and neglect. Years ago now, I had a case where I was reviewing the information in the case, and a gentleman was not secured in the van. Unfortunately, the staff had signed off that he had been secured. When the accident occurred, he ended up getting very severely injured, and that was a case where we ended up with a category 2 finding. So again, it's that more egregious sort of nature. Category 1s are by far the most egregious of conduct. This is where we might see a sexual abuse case, for example, pretty egregious physical abuse cases along those lines. And I think what's important to point out about category 1 in particular, if you recall at the beginning, I mentioned that we didn't have consistent ways, right, of protecting individuals in our state, of ensuring that a staff person who engaged in abuse and neglect wasn't able to just move around. So a category 1 results in, once it's upheld, results in the staff person or the subject being placed on our staff exclusion list. And the staff exclusion list is part of the background check process that happens and essentially will prevent that person from, again, being able to work with vulnerable populations under our jurisdiction. The other way that someone will potentially end up on the staff exclusion list is if they have 2 separate cases where each of those cases have a category 2 finding in a 3-year period. So there's kind of 2 different ways of potentially ending up on the staff exclusion list. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. But the final category I wanted to mention, and again, you can see here, it's pretty small. And the numbers generally, I think, are reflective of the cases. So we talked about the category 3s being sort of less egregious. So that is what we kind of expect to see. I often tell people that if the numbers were reversed and if 73% of our cases were category 1s, that would definitely be cause for alarm. So I think this is pretty reflective of what we expect and the trends that we've seen over the years. But back to category 4. So category 4 cases are really focused on the providers. So for example, you may have a program where there wasn't a certain training implemented, and because of that, something may have occurred. The staff person wouldn't have known to do something differently because there wasn't training in place or there wasn't a policy in place. And so in those cases, we are making a finding against the provider specifically. The other thing that happens with category 4 findings is that our, again, Prevention and Quality Improvement Unit receives those findings. They will then conduct audits and they will look at the corrective action plans. So we've identified that there was an issue with training, for example. Did they go through and train all of the staff appropriately? Maybe there was an issue with a policy. Did they update the policy and implement it and train everyone the way they were supposed to? And all of that information is then sent back to the state agency. So again, I think that's just another important element of the way in which we both investigate abuse and neglect, but also focus on prevention, because our goal ultimately is to prevent abuse and neglect in the systems that we oversee. So we're going to move on to the next slide. And here I just wanted to highlight that we have a wonderful advisory council. Our advisory council has 19 members, 11 of which are individuals who are receiving services or family members. Our advisory council is really fantastic when it comes to giving us feedback on policy, plans, and programs. Our unit has had the privilege of presenting to the advisory council previously, and they are, the members are appointed by the governor and confirmed by the New York State Senate. So certainly an honor, I think, to both be able to confer with them and also to have them, for the people themselves to be able to serve. And so our advisory council also has a number of committees where they work with investigations, workforce, where they really kind of highlight and bring up and provide their feedback and their perspectives, which help us and guide us in doing the great work that we do here at the Justice Center. So we're going to move on to the next slide. And so I mentioned this briefly when I talked about the staff exclusion list. When we think about our criminal background checks, it's important that I think everyone is aware that we conduct criminal background checks of all prospective employees or volunteers that apply for jobs at providers and programs under our jurisdiction. And then we advise about the individual's suitability for employment. And this essentially creates kind of a safety net to ensure that individuals receiving services are protected, and it lowers that risk of abuse and neglect. We talked about the staff exclusion list. We have about 800 or so people on that list. And I think the most recent number is that we've had about 250 separate times where providers were notified that a person who was on the staff exclusion list had applied for a position. So these are applicants who were already on the staff exclusion list, who through the course of our doing our background checks and staff exclusion list checks, we were able to identify that they were actually on the list. So again, I think this really speaks to the fact that we are able to protect individuals and vulnerable populations in our system. So now we're going to move on to the final slide here. And this is our final slide before our poll and a couple of other things that we'll let you know about. So I mentioned before our hotline. I mentioned that we strongly encourage folks to call us. In addition to the fact that it's 24/7, we do also utilize the language line. So if somebody needs assistance in another language, we do have that available. This is our 1-800 number, 855-373-2122, and that again is for our hotline. For our information line, general questions, disability-related questions, contacting the individual and family support unit, that is 1-800-624-4143. So we're going to move on to the next slide, and we're going to open up a quick poll. At this point, I'll just ask that you please complete the poll, and it's pretty simple. Have you ever engaged with the individual and family support unit? So yes, if you have, where we've supported you on an incident or a case. Yes, regarding general information, if maybe you've just called us about disability-related information, or no, if you've not yet engaged with us. And if you haven't, we strongly encourage you to engage with us now that you're going to learn more about us. So we're going to leave the poll open for the next probably minute or two. And I'm also going to turn it over to Davin. We will also open up for questions. And then after we complete our Q&A portion, we'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back so we can all talk more about the individual and family support unit.
Thank you, Dee. I have been a few questions that have come in. One, I'll answer this for you, give you a break, get a sip of water. A question, somebody wanted to clarify if psychiatric units in hospitals are under the jurisdiction of the Justice Center. And the answer is yes. That would fall under a program that's licensed by the Office of Mental Health, even though it's in a hospital setting. Same if there's a detox program in a hospital that is licensed by the Office of Addiction Supports and Services, that would be under the Justice Center's jurisdiction. But if you're in a medical surgical unit, you would not be under our jurisdiction. There's also a question of the 101 number that people get when they call in an incident. Should that be given out to third parties, such as case managers or other people?
Great question. So in terms of giving out the number, you can. If that person contacts us, we're not going to be able to provide them any information on it. And if that person calls the hotline and says, I have this confirmation number, can you give me more information? They're not going to be able to provide information either.
Thank you. There were a couple questions that I'm just lumping together. People, asking about, can we get better guidance on if something's a significant incident versus neglect, and what about likelihood? So the deal is, if you're reporting something to the Justice Center, you're reporting something where there either was harm or there's risk of harm. You don't need to make that determination. Does this fall under neglect or does it fall under significant incident? The decision to report is based on harm or risk of harm. I always say, if it's something that happened to you or someone you loved, would you want someone to look into it and then take actions to prevent it from happening again? Because at the end, that's what happens with the Justice Center. So you don't need to get wrapped up in that. We will look at the individual cases. There's also been a couple questions which we're not going to answer. As Dee said earlier, if somebody does this, is this a category blah? It always depends on the specifics of the incident, the person who's receiving services, what their conditions are, so it is impossible to answer that question universally. Next question for you, Dee. Do reporters find out about the investigative findings, whether it's substantiated or not?
Great question. So it kind of depends. So if a reporter, for example, is a family member who is a personal representative, they would be one of the people who would receive that letter at the end of the case. They would then find out. If it's a member of the public, if it's a mandated reporter, they are likely not going to find out unless they end up being either a personal representative, a subject in the case, or the individual themselves. So again, I think it's a question we get a lot. We do sometimes get questions from folks that are calling us who are looking for a status update. If they are not the personal rep or the individual, oftentimes we can't provide them with that. What we will do is give a general overview of the process itself and how the systems that we have in place work.
Thank you. A clarifying question. Does the Justice Center review investigations into significant incidents or just investigations into abuse and neglect?
Yeah, so we're focused on abuse and neglect investigations. We would not be able to review significant incidents. But again, if someone makes a report and it's a significant incident, we will, when we're able to, we'll let them know, hey, you know, this was classified as a significant incident, but you may want to contact the provider, and we will work with them on obtaining an appropriate contact with the provider agency.
Correct. And the state oversight agency, the agency that licenses or certifies the program, is responsible for following up on those significant incidents as well. There was a question about what happens when, you know, a person receiving services harms another person receiving services. I'll answer this one for you, Dee. First, that would typically be considered a significant incident. That would be reportable to the Justice Center, but we don't have jurisdiction to find abuse or neglect against a person receiving services. So that incident would be handled by the provider agency and the state oversight agency in that manner.
Can I just add, Davin, that there are some circumstances where if, let's say, there was a lapse of supervision that resulted in that, where we might see it potentially be a neglect case as well.
Right, if there's staff culpability there. Yep. Can providers take actions against a staff member if an allegation is unsubstantiated?
So I always find the word actions interesting. I think that what's important to acknowledge and recognize is that we, the Justice Center, are not the ones making employment decisions. We are not telling a provider that they have to hold someone accountable in a certain way. So regardless of the finding, a provider can absolutely implement safety measures, they can implement training, they can take whatever sort of action they choose to take, regardless of the findings. And we do see that. We see that at times where a provider may say, you know what, we need to update our processes or our policy.
Right, and also if we unsubstantiate somebody, that doesn't preclude an agency from, you know, taking whatever action they need to take. Do families know the category level if an allegation is substantiated?
Yeah, great question. So in the letter that the family member receives, there can also be multiple allegations for a particular case. So maybe we have an allegation of physical abuse and an allegation of neglect, or an allegation of inappropriate restraint and a physical abuse. They will have the different allegations listed along with the substantiated finding and the category finding. Similarly, if it's unsubstantiated, obviously there won't be a category finding, but it'll let them know each of the allegations and that it's been unsubstantiated.
Great. And this last one I will answer. There was a question about, you know, what addictions does the Justice Center, you know, investigate, you know, or under our jurisdiction. Any program that's licensed by the Office for Addiction Services and Supports falls under our jurisdiction. So, and I think most programs will treat people with multiple addictions, but we're not, you know, we're based upon licensure, not based upon what substance somebody is addicted to. So everyone is under our protection. So that's the last question at this point. So I think it's break time. All right, we're back and we're ready to go.
Okay, so we're going to spend the rest of the time providing you with an overview of the Individual and Family Support Unit. We're also going to provide you with some of the Justice Center resources that we find very helpful, and we're going to wrap up with some self-care information. So the Individual and Family Support Unit, also known as IFSU, was created in October of 2013 The unit was in its infancy at that time, and the extent of the need for supportive services was still unknown. However, in time, the growing need for assistance to individuals and families going through the Justice Center processes was identified, and the unit grew based on that need. And we also wanted to point out that the unit also receives funding from the Office of Victim Services, which along with the Justice Center support has allowed us to expand even further. And I just also wanted to touch a little bit on the poll. It looks like the vast majority of the people who answered the poll have not had a lot of engagement with the individual and family support unit. So we're glad that we're actually here today to provide you with information about the unit. So next slide. The Individual and Family Support Unit provides support statewide. The map that you see here, it displays the Justice Center's 5 regions, and each star represents where our staff are located. There are 3 supervisors based out of the regions that oversee the unit, along with the unit director, which is D. I'm also going to go over the locations where our team members are located, but we also wanted to make sure that you understand that even if we don't have an advocate in an office, the advocates do travel, and oftentimes advocates help to cover other regional offices when needed. So we have 3 advocates in our main office location in Del Mar, and we also have which is Region 1, and we also have a regional supervisor, which is myself, and the unit director, which is D. In Region 2, we have an advocate in our 2 offices in Utica and Binghamton, and a regional supervisor in Syracuse who oversees Region 2 and 3. And we also have an ombudsman, which we'll talk about later, who provides services at the Office for People with Developmental disabilities, the 2 remaining developmental centers that are left, Sunmount and Valley Ridge. And then in Region 3, we have an advocate that's located in Rochester and in our West Seneca office. And in Region 4, we have an advocate located in Bronx. We have an advocate located in Brooklyn and the Plainview office. And in Region 5, we have an advocate located in the Poughkeepsie and our Rockland, along with a regional supervisor in White Plains who supervises Regions 4 and 5. And then just by way of some background regarding our advocates come from a variety of educational backgrounds and professional experiences. Some of us are teachers. Some of us have experience with family court, mental health court. Many of us have worked at child advocacy centers, domestic violence shelters, and rape crisis programs, and many of us really have provided direct services under the jurisdiction of the Justice Center. Our advocates, our unit operates during regular business hours, 9 to 5. We do want to point out that we do everything that we can to accommodate the needs of families and individuals. If you need to reach us or you need assistance that's outside of the hours. For example, if a family member maybe works until after 5 and they're only available at 7 p.m. on a Wednesday night, for example, we will do whatever we can to accommodate your schedule. The next slide. We also wanted to provide you with a little data regarding, the number of people that the Individual and Family Support Unit supports. We do support a lot of individuals receiving services as well as their family members across New York State. Since 2013, we have provided assistance to 16,237 individuals and family members. It's important for you to understand that we do receive many more calls than what this number reflects, because we often provide support and have multiple communications with many more individuals and family members than this number reflects. In 2021, we provided 3,276 individuals and family members with advocacy and support. We also wanted to, next slide, we wanted to take a moment really to share a breakdown of the referrals and requests for assistance from individuals and family members based upon the state agency they receive services from. As you can see, our largest request comes from OPWDD, the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities, and the Office of Mental Health. When we get requests from OPWDD and OCFS, and a lot of times with state ed, we're primarily hearing from family members and legal guardians. While when we receive requests for assistance from people who receive services under the jurisdiction of the Office of Mental Health and the Office for Addiction Supports and Services, and we primarily hear from the individuals who receive services themselves. Next slide. We're going to move on to talk a little bit about what the Justice Center advocates can help individuals with. Our advocates make contact with individuals and family or their family members, primarily via phone calls. And when we reach out to people, we're often providing things like an overview of the New York State Justice Center, the Justice Center processes. We're answering a lot of the questions and providing information a lot of about what Dee talked to you earlier about. We also provide case status updates. We can't provide details about the case, but we can let you know if you're a personal representative or an individual receiving services or a legal guardian. We can provide you with the status of the case, whether it's an open case, whether the case is closed, whether the case that was reported ended up being a significant incident. So we can provide you with information like that. We just cannot provide details of the case. It's often helpful when people call us, even though we can't share details, to be able to provide you with whether the case is active and really to explain the process to you and what you can expect next. We often will provide you with information related to if an individual receiving services or a victim of abuse and neglect is going to be having an interview that occurs with the investigator. We can provide you with information about what that process will look like. We'll provide you with information about the role of the advocate. And we also, whenever possible, we let you know, if a case is going to be closing soon and whether you should be receiving a letter of determination in the mail. So it's really a lot of information and, connecting you with what the process looks like and what you can expect next within the case. The other thing that we provide is we also connect people to contacts at provider agencies, whether it's in incident management or quality assurance, or we provide you with contacts at the state agencies, the 6 state agencies that Dee spoke about. We usually try to have people work issues through with the provider agency, but if someone isn't able to resolve or isn't hearing back from the provider agency, we can also help you get contacts at a state agency, and we often do that on behalf of individuals and their family members. Another really important role that we provide is support during a Justice Center-led abuse and neglect case interview, which takes place with the individual receiving services, so the victim, and also sometimes we provide support during individual receiving services interviews who may be a witness to something that occurred. During the interview, we provide emotional support. We do this whenever we can before the interview, definitely during the interview, and then after the interview. After the interview, we often are checking in on individuals to see how they're doing, to see whether they think they're going to need support later on, especially if the interview is very challenging for them. During the interview, we check in on their emotional state. We provide reassurance and validation. And if we see that someone needs to take a break, we'll ask to take a break. And oftentimes, if someone needs to take a break, we may step out of the room and the advocate will provide emotional support, answer any questions, and things of that nature. This is really important that advocates are involved, given the information that individuals oftentimes are sharing with us during these interviews. So we really want to make sure that the interview process is as comfortable as possible. The other thing that we also do oftentimes throughout the case and even after a case closes is we provide information and referral to resources in the community. We do that for individuals receiving services as well as their family members. And we oftentimes will provide contact names and really the contact information for those connections in the community. And as I said, we often are providing individuals receiving services and their family members with contact names at a provider agency as well as the state agency. A lot of times people may want to know from the advocates what kind of safeguards have been put in place so that their loved one, isn't. They want to know what safeguards have been put in place. And while we may not be able to answer that for you, what we can do is get you the contact name of the person that may be able to provide you with that information. And as I said, we also, and Dee mentioned this, we also share relevant Justice Center resources, which we will be discussing a little later on. And we also, our advocates also attend conferences and do presentations similar to the one that we're doing today. We staff, tabling events where we answer a lot of questions and provide resources. So we do have a lot of, we do provide a lot of support and services in the individual and family support unit. I also wanted to point out that we often provide support really throughout the life cycle of a case. And in some cases, we provide ongoing support well beyond the conclusion of a case. Sometimes after a case closes, something may come up later that an individual receiving services or a family member contacts us about so that we can provide them with information and referral. We can move on to the next slide. We also, in addition to everything that we've shared around what we can provide, we wanted to address a few examples of what we are unable to provide within our role. As I mentioned, we can't provide details about the investigation. We can't do this because we do not want to impact the integrity of the case. We are able to provide you with records access. So for instance, at the conclusion of a case, we can provide you with guidance on how to request records where you may be entitled to more information. Oftentimes we get requests for us to provide recordings of reports that are made to the hotline. That's not something that we would be able to provide you. But again, we can provide you with access, information and guidance on how to receive records access. They would not, even with records access, you wouldn't be able to get a recording of a report that's made. Oftentimes, because the process can take some time, and Dee mentioned this earlier, a lot of times things take a lot of time with an investigation because we're gathering evidence, and a lot of times, understandably so, family members and individuals really want us to move the investigation process along more quickly. We know the process can take a lot of time, and that can be stressful and difficult, but it's really important that the agency does a thorough investigation and that we take the time to gather all the information. Even though we can't provide you with detailed information and we can't move things along quicker, we certainly can provide you with support throughout what can be a very difficult process, to hopefully make the process a little smoother and more comfortable for both the individual and family members or legal guardians. We can go ahead and move forward. We also wanted to talk and spend a little bit of time talking about the approaches we take to collaborate with others, both internally and externally. As Dee mentioned earlier, we utilize a multidisciplinary approach, which has been especially effective in carrying out victim-centered and trauma-informed practices. that we promote and the Justice Center promotes. Research shows that this practice and multidisciplinary approach is really best practice. An example of the utilization of this approach is demonstrated by the agency's utilization of the Justice Center sexual abuse response team. This team is made up of staff, and Dee mentioned this a little bit earlier. It's made up with staff with a lot of diverse backgrounds, which includes nurses, attorneys, our advocates are part of this, investigators, and many of the people that are part of this team have worked in settings under the Justice Center's jurisdiction. The team really meets to discuss strategies for investigations of cases and the investigative process. Another example of our multidisciplinary approach is most often in all of our sexual abuse cases and egregious acts of abuse and neglect. An investigator makes a referral to the individual and family support unit, and oftentimes the advocate assists the investigator in scheduling interviews. We oftentimes are the ones that make the initial contact with the individual and or their family members. When we're involved early on, it helps the advocates to really build rapport and trust with both the individual receiving services and their family members, and oftentimes helps make the investigative process a little bit more comfortable and smoother. Advocates provide all the services that we spoke about earlier, explaining an overview of the Justice Center, the processes, what you can expect next, what the interview is, what an interview, why we do interviews, and we answer any questions that family members have, and we provide the necessary supports and services. We also work, again, as I said, throughout the whole process with both the investigator and the individuals and families. And we also sometimes, when we're doing this work and we're talking with individuals and family members, we might be made aware of additional information that may be of benefit to the investigator. We may find out about potential updated medical information, or even the best method of communication for the individual, or things that might be triggering for someone, or other, just other information such as an individual receiving services moved or a family member moved and they have new contact information. So we provide this to the investigator so that they have, the most updated information. So this is a really good example of how that multidisciplinary team approach works and how it's effective. An example, I wanted just to share a recent example. I recently attended an interview with an individual receiving services, and it was involving a sex abuse case. And, the individual let both the investigator and me know that they were very uncomfortable with the process. We gave them the opportunity if they did not want to continue with the interview, and they wanted to continue. As the interview progressed, things, got difficult for the individual, and she asked if she could take a break and talk with me. So we left, we left the interview room, and we took a little walk, and we went to a private area, and she shared that it was becoming too difficult for her to continue with the interview. So we talked about that a little bit, and, I validated how it's difficult. I really allowed her to make that decision. We continued to walk, and we used some of her coping strategies, some breathing exercises, and things like that. And, on our way back from the walk that we took, she let me know that she was feeling comfortable and she wanted to continue with the interview because she wanted this person to be held responsible and she didn't want it to happen to someone else. So we were able to continue that interview. She made that decision, And, I think having the advocate there really, allowed for her to feel safe. Not that she wouldn't have felt that with the investigator, but I was able to provide that support and some of those coping strategies, and she was able to continue with the interview. So those are examples of, the multidisciplinary approach. The other thing that occurred is after the interview, both the investigator and myself made sure that she had supports in place for later. She lived in her own apartment, and we wanted to make sure that, should she, have difficulty later on, that she had supports available. We were able to make a phone call to her clinical supports with her there, and made arrangements that if she was uncomfortable or needed assistance, that she could speak with her clinical supports later. So those were all the kinds of things, in terms of the multidisciplinary team approach. Both the investigator and myself, did that with the individual. You can go ahead and go on to the next slide. As part of this multidisciplinary approach we just discussed, we also wanted to make you aware of several other internalized specialized teams that we're a part of. We're part of the mortality case coordination, where we work closely with investigators on cases involving death of an individual receiving services, and we ensure that we are providing support to, surviving family members. A lot of that, again, is providing support, providing information and referral for grief counseling if needed, but also really explaining the process and providing them with an overview and what they can expect. As we discussed, we're also a part of the sexual abuse response team, and we actively participate. I'm actually a member in our abuse prevention work groups, which are led by the Prevention and Quality Improvement Unit. And we also participate along with members of state agencies, and we identify best practices around abuse prevention. It's something that's really important to the agency, and we participate in that. And then we also participate in medical review board meetings, where voluntary team of medical professionals weigh in on cases that require some medical expertise. You can go on to the next slide. We also really participate and collaborate with a lot of external stakeholders. We participate in external stakeholder meetings with the regional coalition meetings, with other crime victim assistance programs, and those meetings occur all across the state, so advocates participate in those meetings. We're also part of a Trauma Champions Collaborative, where we work with other state agencies on implementing trauma-informed practices. We're part of the Crimes Victims Assistance Task Force, where we participate in annual events to acknowledge victims of crime and their families. We're also part of the New York State Council of Children and Families cross systems meetings, where we collaborate with family and youth groups across all of our state agencies and across New York State. We focus on achieving better outcomes for children, youth, and families by really improving access to services and supports, and collaborating to eliminate service barriers between the systems. By participating in these external stakeholder meetings and collaborating, really allows us to get to know our stakeholders as well as our partners, to get to know the New York State Justice Center. It promotes collaboration, which really increases our referral base, so that when we're providing information and referrals to individuals and family members, we know the agencies that we're providing referrals to, and oftentimes we have contact names at these agencies. And because we collaborate, they know us and we know them. The other thing that we often do is we often identify outreach opportunities where we can present and provide information at conferences and events, again, similar to what we're doing today. And that's really another important aspect of the work that we do, and how collaboration with stakeholders is really important. And we just want to, say to you, if you know of any opportunities where you might want the New York State Justice Center and the Individual and Family Support Unit to present or share information, please be sure to contact us. You have our contact information, and we can certainly discuss it. And oftentimes we do go out and provide presentations. You can go ahead. We also wanted to provide you with a brief overview of the process in the Individual and Family Support Unit when it comes to how we receive and respond to referrals. We receive referrals from a variety of sources. Sometimes it's direct contact. Maybe they got our name at a tabling event or from a presentation like this, but most often the bulk of our referrals come from the hotline or the information line that Dee mentioned earlier. And this typically occurs after an individual or their family member or legal guardian calls the Justice Center and is looking for information either about a case or requires support and or just has general inquiries. So we would receive those referrals from the hotline and the information line. As we discussed, we also get referrals from our investigators. And then once we receive the referrals, we process the referrals. And when we process the referrals, we're taking a look at the location of the referral. If it's an active Justice Center-led case where we are likely to have the advocate where we're likely to have an advocate participate in an interview, we make sure that we assign those referrals to advocates within that office and region. And we also take into account a lot of other factors. For example, if we had contact with someone previously and they've reached out again, even if it's been quite some time, if that advocate is still within the Individual and Family Support Unit, we make every effort to make sure that we assign that referral to that advocate, just because there's already that trust and rapport there, and for consistency purposes. We also, the referral, once we've taken into account all that information, the referral gets assigned, and an advocate reaches out within 1 to 3 business days. Oftentimes, we're hearing from individuals and family members how much they appreciate that we've phoned them back. Oftentimes, people are making a lot of phone calls to a lot of different agencies. And, we have a lot of checks and balances in place to make sure that we're responding within 1 to 3 business days. If it's a more urgent matter, we definitely make the call earlier, usually on the day of service or shortly after we receive the referral. And if it's priority, we always try to make that call within the same business day. Once the referral is assigned to the advocate, that's when the advocate reaches out and provides a lot of the services that we talked about. And, just to point out again and to summarize again, that advocates continue to provide ongoing support as needed throughout the life cycle of a case and oftentimes after a case concludes. We can go on to the next slide. We also mentioned earlier when we were showing you the map that we have an ombudsman, and we really wanted to take a few moments to talk to you about this unique role. The ombudsman is based out of our Utica office, and the ombudsman regularly travels to the 2 remaining developmental centers in New York, Sunmount and Valley Ridge. The ombudsman ensures that the individual's rights are being exercised and protected. The ombudsman is really a frontline advocate who supports individuals in expressing their concerns so that their needs are being heard, that their needs are being acknowledged, and that identified problems are being looked into and taken into consideration and oftentimes resolved. The ombudsman, another large role of the ombudsman is really to help identify any systemic issues or trends that may be present at Sunmount or Valley Ridge. And then we work towards advocating for change. We also strongly encourage and promote self-advocacy and self-determination. We provide a lot of education to the individuals regarding their rights, about good care practices, and we help, we provide them with information so that they can make informed decisions, and it better really enables them to work towards making healthy and informed choices. And we also facilitate a self-advocacy committee where individuals receiving services at Sunmount bring forward things that are going really well, and also provide information about things, issues or concerns, or things that they might want to see improvement on. And that self-advocacy committee is really a wonderful experience, and the ombudsman facilitates that. And the ombudsman also follows up on any issues or concerns that are brought up during that self-advocacy committee meeting. Before moving on to the next session, we wanted to take a moment to answer any questions that folks may have.
Thanks, Crystal. There are a few questions. If a Jonathan's Law meeting is inadequate, what can a family member do? And does can the Justice Center ever provide an advocate for Jonathan's Law meetings?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we are not able to participate in Jonathan's Law meetings specifically. While we provide a lot of information on Jonathan's Law, we are not able to enforce it. What we can do is, and we've worked with families on this before, is identifying a point of contact with the provider agency. If it's something that needs to be elevated beyond that, will certainly help facilitate contact with a contact at the state agency that oversees that particular provider as well to address any concerns or issues. There's also, just separately as a side note, for OPWDD, there is an appeals process under Jonathan's Law if someone feels that they're not receiving the information that they're looking for.
Great, thank you. And can you clarify the interview support that Justice Center advocates provide during an investigation? Is that just for Justice Center-led investigations?
Yeah, so I can take that. Yes, the advocates who attend interviews, it is only for Justice Center led investigations. We don't have enough resources, and we only provide that service for Justice Center led cases. But if there's information and referrals and questions about any abuse and neglect case, whether we are investigating or not, we still provide information and referral and explain the process and what to expect and things like that.
And if I can just add, I think it's also important to emphasize that our support during interviews is specific to the individuals receiving services who are either the victim of the abuse neglect, a witness who is an individual receiving services, and or on occasion a family member who we're interviewing. So we're limited in our scope in terms of who we provide services and supports to generally, but in particular for interviews.
Right. We don't provide support to staff during interviews. Are there any resources that an agency who's doing an investigation can provide to people receiving services before, during, and after an interview if they're conducting the investigation?
I mean, certainly if an agency wants to provide the individual and family support unit contact information, we certainly can provide, again, information about the process and answer questions. We wouldn't be able to provide any details of a case, but certainly we can walk people through the process, and we often do that. We often explain letters of determination, even if it's a case that we haven't been the ones who investigated, because we are the ones making the final determinations.
And we do have a lot of great resources, which we'll be covering in the next portion, where, again, they're available via print. If you request them from us, we can ship them out, but they're also available on our website. Including the guidance document that Crystal will talk about in a little bit, that really goes into a lot of detail around our processes and what to expect, particularly for individuals and families.
Thank you. And if a family member believes that a provider gave false or misleading information during an investigation that could have impacted the results, what can that family member do about that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly encourage them to call the hotline and provide any additional information that they feel needs to be considered in our investigations.
Does the individual family support unit automatically reach out to families where a death occurred, or do you wait for the family to contact you?
Yeah, great question. We either are going to respond to a referral where a family member has contacted us directly, or a referral that came to us from an investigator, for example. We do have certain cases where we also get referrals directly from the investigators that are reviewing the death cases themselves, and they will also assign those referrals to us. Our involvement in the mortality case coordination also, again, allows us to have a direct way to contact families. But generally speaking, we always encourage families to always reach out to us, and we're happy to provide any support we can.
Thank you. Can legal guardians be present during an interview, an investigative interview, if they want to be?
That's a great question. So generally, I think it depends on the type of case. So for criminal cases, no, we would not be able to allow a family member into those interviews. I know that there have been some occasions where potentially at the beginning of the interview, before any confidential information is discussed, a family member may be involved. Generally speaking, what we can do is provide a lot of support and resources to the family member. And ideally, we're there in the interview with the individual, providing them with support. And then later we can follow up with the family member and again, provide them general overview of the processes.
Thank you. And before we move on to the next one, I just want to emphasize, because this question came up, all of the services that the Individual and Family Support Unit provides are free, regardless of anyone's income, disability, no matter what, it's free. All right. Continue on, Crystal.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for those great questions. We are going to spend some time providing you with information about a variety of resources that can be helpful really in explaining our roles and the services that the Justice Center provides. All of these resources, as we've said, can be found on our website. Most of them are also available in print. And we are also providing you with information in a handout. And today we will be focusing on several that we regularly utilize and that the individuals and families have found most helpful. So if you want to go ahead and move forward, we wanted to share with you that we, on our website, we have a disability resources page. It's user-friendly. And the page provides individuals with disabilities, family members, caregivers, staff at provider agencies, and advocates with info on programs, services, and laws and regulations really across New York State. It includes categories, just to name a few, such as transportation, healthcare, housing. A lot of the categories that we have on the website are, are regarding information or inquiries that we get from individuals receiving services and or their family members, and sometimes even from staff or case care managers, things like that. So we really encourage you to take a look at the disability resources page on our website. There's a lot of good information. There's also a user-friendly search feature to the disability resources page, so that if you wanted to find out specific information, maybe about housing, it will bring you to all of the information on in the disability resources on housing, for instance. You're also going to find information about the technology-related assistance for individuals with disabilities, often known as TRADE program, on our website. This program provides access to assistive technology to any New Yorker with a disability throughout New York State. And on the website, you will find regional trade centers, and their locations. Just a little bit more about the regional trade centers. They provide device loans and hands-on training to people with disabilities. I've, in my previous career, I've actually been a part of, when the Regional Trade Center came out to a school program actually, and provided, information on some of the latest technology that's available. The other thing that's great about the Trade Center, if someone, has an assistive technology need, and they're not sure whether it's going to work out for them, oftentimes you may be able to test that technology out if they have it located at one of the trade centers. And sometimes even if one trade center location doesn't have it, they reach out to the other programs across the state to see if they might have a piece of assistive technology. It's a great program, and it really offers individuals an opportunity to access assistive technology really in their everyday living and for work or school. It's really a program that's great for individuals with disabilities, and I really encourage you to take a look at it. I think it's a very underutilized program, so we're happy to really provide you with information about it. The next resource that we're going to be providing is on the next slide. It's one of our most popular resources. We often give this out at conferences, presentations, and if we're part of an interview with an individual receiving services, we provide it. It's nice because it's pocket-sized card, and it really does feature information on the individual family support unit, but it also provides information on reporting to the hotline, and most importantly, it features contact information at each of the 6 state agencies under the Justice Center's jurisdiction. Another great feature about this card is that it's perforated so that one side can be provided to the individual and or their family member, and you can also provide the other part to the mandated reporter, which has relevant information both for a mandated reporter as well as an individual receiving services or their family member. The next document, moving on, is a document that Dee mentioned. It's the Justice Center Reporting and Investigations Guidance for Individuals and Families. It's really our most comprehensive guidance document. It does a really nice job of explaining the process of the agency from reporting, classification, jurisdiction, and it really walks you through all the way to a conclusion of a case, and it explains how about findings of cases, and it has a lot of frequently asked questions and the answers to them. Even though the advocates explain, the process and an overview of the Justice Center, I think the guidance document is really a great tool for individuals and families to refer back to. Oftentimes, you may think of something or have a question, and you may really be able to find it in this guidance for individuals and family members. The other part that I like to point out is the process chart at the end of the document, which explains the case process, which Dee discussed earlier in the presentation. Moving on, our final resource that we're going to share today is the Jonathan's Law Incident Notification and Records Access Brochure. This brochure will assist you in understanding the process for obtaining information about incidents involving individuals receiving services. It really provides information and guidance on records access and how to obtain more information that you may be entitled to from the provider agencies themselves. Keep in mind that Jonathan's Law only applies to the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities and Office of Mental Health and Office of Addiction Services and Supports. As we mentioned earlier, we can also provide you with records access guidance for the other 3 state agencies and the programs that are licensed, operated, and serviced by those 3 state agencies, sorry. Moving on. We also wanted to encourage you to take a look at our great video series, which provides really a lot of good information. It explains our mission. It provides a lot of information on prevention resources and the importance of reporting abuse and neglect. It's available right on our site, and it doesn't take that long to get through, and it's a lot of really valuable information. And then moving forward, we also wanted to talk to you about prevention, spotlight on prevention. We wanted to share with you ways in which the Justice Center has both established layers of safeguards as well as produced materials really meant to help providers protect vulnerable individuals from abuse and neglect. This information on our site includes our spotlight on prevention, and it also provides information for agencies where you can do a self-assessment. It dives deep into that, and you can really assess your own agency. It has best practices for abuse-free environments, and it also provides information on our code of conduct. And I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the code of conduct. It really establishes a uniform set of ethical standards for treatment of people with special needs. And the code of conduct must be signed by all staff who have regular and substantial contact with individuals receiving services when they are hired, and also annually. And then we also provide train-the-trainer sessions, so you can check out the provider and staff section of our website and go to training to learn more about this train-the-trainer code of conduct training. I really encourage you to take a look at the website and look at our spotlight on prevention. It's got a lot of great information. Moving forward. We're also, want to talk more about the information that's contained in the Justice Center Spotlight on Prevention Toolkits. It's offered as a resource for provider agencies and staff. The resources are really intended to be used as a guide for agencies and staff. It can be modified as needed, really, to apply to the types of programs and specific age groups of vulnerable people. These resources were developed really because of the trends that were identified by the Justice Center and our state agencies, and really by reviewing a lot of extensive data related to the cases that we received. These toolkits, as you can see, range from dangers of being left in vehicles to maintaining professional boundaries and for many of you who may already be aware of this, we also added 2 new toolkits, which are on body checks. There's a lot of wonderful information on how to conduct body checks. And also one of our newest toolkits is responding to medical emergencies. Again, these include sample policies. They also include fact sheets, and there's case studies. And I just really want to strongly encourage you to take a look. Abuse prevention is so important, and if we can provide you with a spotlight on prevention and prevention toolkits to assist you with doing that, right here is a lot of great information for you. We wanted to, moving forward, we wanted to really wrap up the session.
Crystal?
As we, yes?
There's a couple questions before you go into self-care. Quickly, a lot of people have been asking about where can they get hard copies of the resources that you've just mentioned, like the Jonathan's Law brochure and this handy dandy thing.
Okay, if you reach out to the information line and or even the individual and family support unit, and we'll provide the contact information. Any of the resources that we have available that are in print, we can make sure we get it out to you. But you can also go on the website, and there's links for many of these resources, and you can print them out yourselves. There's access to the information is all on the website, but
Yeah.
the hard print materials we can provide for you just by contacting us.
Right. Yeah, I think people want the hard copies
Mhm.
as well. And is there a protocol for providers issuing the guidance for family members, individuals and families about the investigative process? I don't believe there is. It's a great best practice that we recommend if you want to give it to people. And that guidance has been available for quite a few years now. So it's, if you're just discovering it today, then we have succeeded in our mission. All right, Crystal, go ahead.
So we wanted to wrap up and really take a moment to recognize the importance of self-care. We at the Justice Center really promote self-care, and we really wanted to also, promote self-care to all of you. We know that navigating the system and even, going through the Justice Center process may be an added stressor to people who are receiving services, as well as family members and provider agency staff. So we think it's really important to wrap up with some self-care. We also recognize, as Dee said, that the last 2 years have been especially challenging for everyone. And we really want you to take some time and to reflect and really invest in yourself and value yourself and take some time for self-care. We thought that we would give you, kind of the definition of self-care, and it's really the practice of taking action to preserve or improve one's own health, the practice of taking an active role in protecting your own well-being and happiness, and really in particular in times of stress. By really taking some time to think about self-care, and we also are providing you with a self-care plan, which is really helpful in helping you really think and reflect about self-care, but also carry out some self-care activities. We wanted to talk a little bit further also about some of the areas of self-care and activities that you can do that are within the plan. So if you want to move forward, some of the self-care areas that are talked about in the work plan are things that have to do with your workplace, profession, or school. Things that, really types of activities related to this for self-care is requesting supervision, maybe debriefing with a colleague if you've had a difficult day at work, maybe some professional development opportunities that really interest you, and things like taking a lunch, leaving work on time, and always, whenever possible, leaving work at work so that you can enjoy your time outside of work with your family. Those are all things, that you can, activities that you can do in terms of workplace and professional, or if you're in school, types of self-care activities. And then, when we talk about the physical, we all mostly know that that's really taking care of your physical being, and easy ways to do that. Things like getting some exercise, whether that's just a 5-minute walk, whether it's getting up from your desk or the couch and stretching or moving around. Things like getting good sleep, healthy nutrition. The other area that it talks about is psychological self-care. And this is really any activity that involves learning, thinking, and growing. It could be something as simple as a puzzle, something like a crossword puzzle. Also, there's research that shows even taking a different route home from work can be good for your psychological self-care. You're seeing new things. It keeps your mind sharp. So things like that are great for psychological self-care. And then emotional self-care, it's really, this is really when you become aware of and identify what you're feeling, and then allow yourself to kind of reflect on it and to lean into the feelings in a way that honors yourself and, that helps your emotional state. It could be something, where you reach out to supportive friendships. For some people, it means counseling, but it doesn't have to mean that. Anything that takes care of your emotional well-being. And then relationships, I think we all found this during the pandemic, really nurturing relationships that are important to you, but also, limiting relationships or time with people that drain you of your energy. And I think sometimes if you've had a particularly difficult week, it can be okay to set up boundaries with regard to those relationships that maybe do drain you, and that's okay too. But I think activities in terms of relationships, getting together with your friends, maybe a date night with your spouse or your significant other, things of that nature. And then really the other, area that the work plan that we're providing you with talks about the spiritual, and that's really activities that soothe your soul. It can be things like meditation, yoga. Oftentimes when we do self-care presentations, a lot of people share that their way of or activity for spiritual self-care is to be outside in nature and things like that. So the thing that I want to stress is that self-care can be very simple little things that help you to feel better and that take care of you. And I encourage you to take the time, to really engage in self-care. If you want to move forward, we really want to, you to take the time to invest in yourself. Hopefully you will create a plan, and even if you don't want to use the plan that we're providing for you, you can come up with your own plan. It doesn't have to be anything too difficult. Some people's plan is simply writing things on their calendar, scheduling time on their calendar. That may be how they create their plan. Moving on to scheduling time, it's really important that you take the time to schedule time. I think, for a lot of us, self-care can take a back seat, but oftentimes people find that if they schedule the time, whether it's to take a walk, to set a timer to get up and take a break during your work day, to leave on time, I often will actually write on my calendar at 4 p.m. to leave work on time. Those are all things that you can do to schedule time to make sure that you're taking care of your self-care. And then really implementing your plan, that can be really difficult for people. Again, it doesn't have to be anything extensive, but I think anytime you can do little things to really promote self-care and that's important, and you really need to go ahead and implement it and find ways to do that. Sometimes it takes practice, and sometimes you have to tweak the plan so that you actually implement it. And I think it really does take commitment. You really have to believe and understand that self-care is important. Really, in order for you to take care of others, especially if we're working in this profession, in order to really assist others and provide advocacy, it's really important that you take care of yourself as well in order to do that. So, I think if you really kind of focus on all of these steps that we talked about, what you do, that really leads to self-care. And I also want to say, if you schedule time or you have something on your plan and you don't get to it, it's okay. Don't beat yourself up. I mean, I have for several months had a plan to go to the gym, and it doesn't always happen. Oftentimes it doesn't happen, but I still, I don't beat myself up. And sometimes rather than going to the gym, I just take a walk with my dogs, and that really, takes care of myself and my well-being. And I just don't beat myself up over it. So really, to wrap up, I also wanted to talk more about the plan and really to let you know that customizing a self-plan, it really is a preventative measure for you. It helps you stay the course, and it's created by you and filled hopefully with activities, self-care activities that you like and make you happy. It can also provide you with important reminders and ways to really activate your self-care. And really having a plan takes the guesswork out of what to do and how to improve your well-being in times of stress. You have your self-care plan to turn to in moments of crisis or stress. So I'm going to encourage you again to really take a look at self-care and invest in yourself if you want to move forward. We also wanted to take a poll, and we have been providing a lot of self-care presentations internally as well as externally, and we would like to know, would you be interested in attending a presentation on self-care? You can answer yes, a virtual presentation, yes, an in-person presentation, yes to either virtual or in-person, or no, you're not interested. That will really help us to decide whether agencies would like more information and presentations on self-care. So just take a few moments to answer that for us. And then moving forward, as we mentioned before, we are available to provide support and information. You can email us at supportcoordinator@justicecenter.ny.gov, or you can call the information line at 1-800-624-4143. And if you're seeking assistance from the Individual and Family Support Unit, you can just let them know that you're looking to speak to an advocate, and they will take a message, and they will get your contact information, and a referral will be sent to us. As a reminder, we do respond to the majority of our referrals within 1 to 3 business days. We are also going to use the rest of the time here today to answer any more of your questions. Please feel free to add your contact information along with your question in the chat box. If we don't get to all of your questions today, we will get to you in the coming days ahead. And then as a reminder to everyone, you're going to get a copy of the PowerPoint, resources, relevant links, and a copy of the self-care plan as we discussed in the coming days. And there's also a link for feedback survey in the chat. We really value your feedback and input, and would appreciate it if you would take a few moments to just complete that survey.
Thank you, Crystal. There are no further questions, so have a nice afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.